and welcome to this very special edition of the monthly IoT Security Foundation webinar. Tomorrow, the Radio Equipment Directive requirements become mandatory, and we'll be taking a deep dive into all of it during the next 60 minutes. Before we get going, if you're watching the YouTube recording of this broadcast, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and even better, set us to alerts so that you know whenever we add new content. We've got a massive amount to get through today, so let's get into it. Coming up in the hour, we'll have a roundtable discussion with the following people, and if everybody wants to give a wave as I read out your name. There's Carlos Perez Ruiz of BSI. There is Carlos Serratos of NXP. We've also got David Pashley of Direct Insight, Joe Lomico of Tuvsud. We've also got Natiel Coutier of Red Alert Labs and Paul Phillips of Residio joining us today. So before we get to the panel discussion, we're going to be welcoming back to the IoT Security Foundation webinar Richard Marshall of Xitex. Richard was the IoTSF plenary chair for 5 years and a founding member of the IoT Security Foundation. He's one of the lead authors of the Foundation's Assurance Framework, which has been internationally recognized by the EU's ETSI and US NIST standard bodies as a point of reference for IoT security. Richard was also a contributor and reviewer for the UK government's Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security, ETSI's technical standard TS 103645 and harmonized standard EN 303645 on IoT security, and more recently, an expert on the Senelec WG8 Red and WG9 CRA European Cyber Security Standards Committees. Richard is currently the chair of the BSI Special Working Group Cyber Resilience Act Standardization Request, whose role it is to lead the BSI expert delegation in Senelec for the coordination of the cybersecurity standardization activities relating to the EU's CRA. If you're watching this broadcast live, please put any and all questions, comments, observations in Zoom chat, and I'll put them to Richard and the roundtable panel a little bit later. But let's get going. Richard Marshall of Xitex, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, we'll move on from a fairly wordy introduction, and as Chris says, get into the meat of it. So I will do my best to get some slides up. Pick the right window. That was a bonus. So just a quick recap. Obviously, today's focus is about the Red Article 3.3 delegated articles and how they impact your products from a cybersecurity point of view. Just a quick reminder for those, I'm sure everybody is familiar, but the actual deadline for implementation is, believe it or not, tomorrow. But that, of course, was the purpose of timing the call today. So just a quick recap. Geopolitics, we're all familiar with it. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of things driving cybersecurity. I'm certainly not going to do all of them. The one we're really interested in is the one in the orange circle down the bottom. Not going to particularly talk about NIST 2 for obvious reasons. Radio equipment being the primary focus, but we will touch a little bit later on CRA and just how Red leads into CRA. So for those who aren't familiar, if you're not already familiar, why did it come through Red is probably one of the obvious questions. And the driver was that the EU wanted to do something about product security. And one of the challenges was to actually bring out a new directive, a la CRA, for example, it takes time. And the Commission wanted to move reasonably rapidly to get cybersecurity regulation into products, and notably wireless ones. And the Radio Equipment Directive, fortunately, even back in its 2014 guise, did include some provisions. This is these articles 3.3 D, E, and F, which made a comment on security. But at the time in 2014, they were what's called deprecated. In other words, they were not mandatory provisions and therefore didn't drive regulation. So a quick recap. So back in 2022, the Commission updated the legislation and effectively then made the provisions mandatory as of tomorrow. The slides, I can check, Chris, I'm sure the slides will be available later, so you don't need to take in all of the detail there, but that's at least, as it were, where the regulations have come from. So quick reminder, RED, of course, is a product-based standard, whereas CRA will be, when it comes, is a broader set of regulations around product and process. Having said that, RED still does have some implications for corporate process, and we'll touch a little bit on that later in this presentation. So, what does it actually mean? So the first and crucial one, of course, is 3.3D, which is network related, and specifically was the concern of increasing cybersecurity to protect networks. Fairly obvious, we're all very reliant on networks today, the cellular network being an obvious one. There are some exemptions. So civil aviation, motor vehicles and road toll systems will fall outside of the articles 3.3E and F, but the crucial thing being 3.3D, which is anything network related, still does apply. 3.3E is far more focused on the provisions of personal data and the privacy of the user. And then finally, 3.3F is pertaining to any product that, as it were, processes or handles financial transactions. And it's worth making the point that these standards are not layered. In other words, for example, if you were handling financial transactions, does that mean you only have to comply with 3.3F? And the answer is no, they're layered. So if you have radio equipment, then 3.3D applies and you have to comply with the terms of those. If you then include that there is personal data or privacy implications of the data your product's handling, 3.3E comes in. Now, there is a little bit of commonality, but there are additional provisions that come in as you bring in articles 3.3E and 3.3F. So in terms of scope, and this is, I'm sure we'll discuss this one a little bit more, but the crucial thing about the delegated regulations, and in particular Article 1, is to do with, in the case of 3.3D, is any radio equipment that can communicate itself over the internet. And the piece that sometimes tends to get, this sentence often gets quoted, but it's only really got any meaning if it includes the run-on, which is whether it communicates directly or via any other equipment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. In terms of E, as we discussed already, that's particularly any personal data. And just a reminder, that's not just the obvious human data of names and addresses, but also includes things like location data. So certainly, we've seen scenarios where products have, as it were, inadvertently have location data held within them, and then suddenly they find the product is included in the scope of 3.3E, and as a result, sometimes it certainly in the case of RED, it may be possible to rescope a product where that data is perhaps moved off the product, potentially into the cloud. And then there are a few exceptions. So we touched obviously on civil aviation. Medical is another one. Childcare and clothing are also, they are accepted. Finally, as we noted already, F covers anything to do with money, financial transactions, etc. And obviously there are some slightly tighter provisions to do with that, with those types of products. So a few common questions come up. The first one inevitably is, and we're back to that piece of the wording in the regulation about a product connecting to the internet, with the crucial caveat of indirectly or directly. So certainly one question that crops up quite frequently is, but my product doesn't use an IP protocol over the air interface. And the short answer to that is, if the data emanating over that wireless interface then, as it were, propagates out onto the internet, even if the protocol changes, for example, then the product would still be deemed to be in scope, or you'd have to have a very good reason why it wasn't. Because if you think about some of the gateways that perhaps have like lower power radio interfaces, but perhaps then connect to the internet either via Ethernet or possibly Wi-Fi, those types of products, certainly routers, are very much in scope. Another interesting one, this is pertinent because obviously a lot of companies in the past have used compliant radio modules as a way of achieving their compliance for the radio performance of their product, with the usual caveats, of course, that if you put more than one module in, then you have to start doing your own radio testing because of interoperability. But the thing to remember is that the radio module is but a component of the product. So yes, it helps you having a compliant radio module in the same way as when you were doing radio compliance work. But the crucial point is that the regulation applies to the product in its totality and not just the radio module. So as a product manufacturer, you still need to be compliant with the regulation, because just bringing a component in that's secure doesn't in itself make a secure product. Kind of partly answered this question. So are radio modules being a component out of scope? The short answer to that is no, they're not, because obviously they are included. And we are fortunate there are quite a lot of manufacturers in the radio module space who've already have made quite a lot of strides in that area of ensuring that their product will be compliant to meet the regulations coming in tomorrow. Occasionally get answered this question: my product doesn't have any financial or personal data in the product, is it out of scope? The short answer is yes, it's out of scope for articles 3.3E and F, but it's still very much in the scope of 3.3D. So yes, it's a lesser assessment burden, but your product would still need to be assessed, or more precisely, and at that point is then whether or not you would be using doing self-assessment or having the product tested, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. Another obvious question: so what impact does this have on the CE marking of my product? Well, in very simple terms, because of the regulation coming into force tomorrow, obviously if you have an in-scope radio product, then clearly you have to update your declaration of conformance to include the relevant articles, either 3.3D or F. And as a result, of course, that means you should have done, at the very least, the self-assessment work to be able to make that declaration. But what it's also worth making the point about is that if you haven't done that and you're still declaring the product as being compliant, then effectively the CE mark on the product as of tomorrow effectively is not legitimate, because obviously you can only put a CE mark on a product having been able to declare that the product is compliant with all of the relevant regulations, which obviously if you're doing a radio product in scope of this, you obviously do need to have done that assessment work to be able to maintain the CE mark on your product. So the obvious question is, fine, okay, I've now got to do some assessment work, but what standards do I need to, or standards do I need to comply with? There's a three-part harmonised standard. For those who aren't already familiar with it, EN 18031, which is published by Senelec, and is, certainly if you're in the UK, is available on the BSI standard site. In three parts. So part one relates to Article 3.3E. Surprise, surprise. Part two relates to 3.3E, and part three applies to 3.3F. Why? What the one obvious question is, why would harmonised standards be important? Well, the importance of harmonised standards is that obviously they apply across all of the EU 27 countries, and where they are cited in the EU's official journal, that standard can then be used as what's called a presumption of conformity. In other words, if you as a manufacturer can demonstrate that you comply with the harmonised standard, then you have a presumption of conformity and therefore can make the declaration of conformance in your DOC. There are some exceptions. So what citation restrictions mean is that these are things you can't rely on the standard for to presume conformity. Unsurprisingly, obviously, the rationale, compliance with rationale or guidance sections does not presume conformity. There were some other exceptions noted here. So password management, if the user is not allowed to set or use a password, then you would need to seek notified body input. So that applies to the clauses on the screen. And in the same case, parental and guardian access control for toys and childcare, the standard doesn't provide sufficient support for conformity and would need third-party assessment, or at least a notified body opinion as to what controls would be necessary. The other point that was made is around secure updates, particularly in the context of financial asset protection, and the standard can't be used for compliance in that area. And for financial products, third-party assessment is mandatory. So that obviously involves bringing a test house to do a third-party assessment of your product, where it's controlling, it's processing or handling financial information. We'll skim through that. The other point of note, of course, is that if you need to seek a notified body opinion, then obviously it must be an EU-based one. Now, obviously, there are organisations in the UK, but they typically will need to be sufficiently large enough to have EU representatives in the form of notified bodies who can be who are qualified, at least in terms of the EU and the Commission, to be able to make decisions on any exceptions. So there's three essential foundations to the standards. We've touched upon it a little bit: network, privacy, financial, and in very simple terms, network assets are obviously any configuration parameters or functions or data that relate to the security of the network functions. In the same way for privacy assets, so again, any data, information or privacy functions again would fall under the definition of privacy asset. So again, that's back to 3.3E. And similarly for financial assets, so you can see these line up they line up to the concept of network privacy and financial assets line up directly with the three parts of the standard. So in the standard, for most sections, there are some sections where this doesn't always hold true, but normally in most of the requirements, there are 3 assessment steps. The first one being the conceptual one. So the classic what's in scope, do all the mechanisms meet the relevant requirements. Obviously, then is the next assessment being around, has what's been described or specified, is that complete to be able to meet the regulations? And then obviously finally, is what's been implemented in the product, is that sufficient and does it meet the requirements? So if we take a conceptual example, in this case, this is the secure update. In each of the requirements, I won't do this in detail, but you can see the flow. There are decision trees in the conceptual assessment which allow you to see what elements are in scope and what are not. So, for example, if we went down as far as some-1 decision 3, one of the questions, of course, is whether or not the software firmware is immutable. So clearly, obviously, if it's immutable, it's in read-only memory, then clearly you can't update it. So that hopefully gives a feel for what is in the assessment, at least in the conceptual assessment part. So I'm keeping an eye on time here, and I'm keen that we have a discussion. So obviously in functional completeness, it's very much about, are all of the various mechanisms in place? Are they scoped and documented to ensure that they meet the requirement? So if you like, this is very much the, as it were, product level requirements and validating them that they meet the requirements of the standard. And then functional sufficiency, I'm going to skim this very slightly. Obviously, this is about validating that what's actually been implemented, i.e. how the product's been developed, do all of they meet the actual requirements that have been specified. Quick heads up of the provisions. This is 18031 Part 1 and through 3. I'm not going to do them all, obviously. That would take quite some time, but that just gives you, those are some of the section titles where you can see there are some subtle differences between the parts. For example, logging doesn't appear in Part 1 in the network standard, but it does appear both in the privacy and the financial standards. Again, I'm not going to do this in detail, but for those who are interested and perhaps want some practical ways to see what's involved with compliance, here's a cross mapping of the IoTSF's assurance framework and the provisions in the assurance framework that would help support being able to declare that you were compliant with the provisions in the standard. And hopefully, always the aim of the assurance framework has been that that's in a more detailed way, which is actually a lot easier to assess, because inevitably 18031 is a horizontal standard and obviously had to be written in quite a generic way. So some of the requirements do need a little bit of a deeper dive to understand exactly what the implications are for your product. Oh, excuse me. I won't do all those in detail. A word of caution. You heard me say in the beginning of the presentation that this is a product only standard set of regulations. However, there are some general provisions. GEC1 is a good example. The equipment shall not include publicly known exploitable vulnerabilities. And obviously, to be able to do that, you need a vulnerability management process. Did I say process? So it isn't just about product. The other thing to keep in mind, and I'll touch on it briefly in a second, is about to do with CRA. But the thing to remember is that once you start to put together the evidence for compliance with GEC1, it becomes very evident that to be able to make that declaration, it's not just about your product. It's also about how you communicate, obviously, your products and services to be able to make that declaration. Obviously, things like validation and support. But one of the major areas where RED is having an impact, and CRA will be even greater, is in supply chain and partner support. So, for example, if you're buying in modules, one of the first questions would be, do you have a cybersecurity patching support policy or agreement with that supplier? Because obviously what you don't want to do as a manufacturer is supply a product, say, on a 5 or a 10-year life, only to find out that the embedded firmware that might be in a component that you're putting in the product is only supported for security patches for 2 years. And then obviously there's the wider vulnerability disclosure policy, which I'm not going to touch on too much because that's really comes into its own next year in CRA. So a quick one on security update. One of the things that really RED drives is if you're able to do ongoing security management and be able to support your products, you can see fairly quickly that you don't need that big a fleet of product before you need some way of doing some degree of automated security updates and the ability to deliver critical patches clearly in a timely manner. As I'm sure you've seen with some of the headlines, it's crucial now to be able to get fixes out. And obviously it's not quite the same as ransomware, but if you don't want to be if your company doesn't want to be in the spotlight of vulnerabilities, then obviously the quicker you can fix a potential vulnerability, the less time you spend in the limelight. So these are a few questions that I'm not going to touch on because I see we're time's cracking on as usual. But there's a few things to think about in terms of ongoing support. Already mentioned support policy for your incoming supply components, but you yourself may be a supplier supplying into for example, a bigger system. So what is your security support policy feeding into your customers? Things like end of life policies. Do you have is there a revocation process, etc., etc. And the reminder being obviously that the importance of having a vulnerability disclosure policy and process in place is so that you can ensure that you're getting you identify issues with your product and get them remedied. Otherwise, of course, the stuff of your board level is going to be ending up becoming one of the headlines such as these. And as you can see, this isn't, some of these are good examples of, quite reputable firms who, sorry about that, who clearly, would prefer not to be in the limelight. So in the obvious question, demonstration of compliance. So obviously all products need a declaration of conformance. Clearly, an assessment has to be done against the relevant standard, and obviously that should be documented in the technical file. So the thing to remember is that without an updated declaration of conformance referring to Articles 3.3 D and F as appropriate, a CE mark can't legitimately be applied to a product from the 1st of August, i.e. tomorrow. I'm going to skim through CRA because I'm mindful of time and I don't want to take any more time out. But just a quick reminder that obviously CRA is bigger in scope. It deals also with software products, so items in the cloud. And there is a whole tranche of harmonized standards which are coming. There's something like nearly 31 standards coming, 3 that will relate to horizontal standards, i.e. products that don't fall in specific verticals. And then there is a whole raft of verticals where there are standards for specific industrial sectors. I'm going to skip through that. Quick reminder of timelines. So the next major milestone after tomorrow will be the 30th of August next year, because by then you will need to have a vulnerability disclosure policy in place, and obviously then the verticals and the horizontals then come in late 26 and late 2027. So this one, I'm going to say thank you very much. I hope you found that informative, and I'm going to hand back to Chris. Thank you.
Brilliant stuff, Richard. Thank you very much indeed. A couple of things that I need to mention before we go into the panel section of today's broadcast, which I'll try and get through quickly. The 2025 IoTSF conference takes place at London's IET on Thursday, the 30th of October. And so far, we've got Dex Hunter Tariki, formerly of SpaceX, Facebook, and the United Nations confirmed as a keynote. We'll also have a senior speaker from the NCSC, but we can't name that person in line with their security policy. Lastly, for the moment, we'll have Minister Ferial Clark. She is the UK Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for AI and Digital Government, and she'll deliver the opening address at this year's conference. Sponsorship and exhibitor packages are available right now, and if you book before the end of today, you'll get 15% off any and all sponsor and exhibitor packages. So move fast. Go to iotsf-ai.org. If you're watching this broadcast live, I've put the link in Zoom chat, and if you're watching the recording, we'll put the link in the description below. The next IoTSF monthly webinar will happen on Thursday, 28th of August, and we'll be joined by Device Authority's Amit Rao in Bangalore/Bengaluru. And his presentation will be Post-Quantum Cryptography for IoT, Securing Devices for the Quantum Future. We'll also have Javier Martinez, who is the CEO of Lorisk. He's also a former VP and General Manager at ARM. He'll be talking about the Open Titan project, which is an open source silicon root of trust. If you're watching this podcast live, the link to register for the August webinar is in Zoom chat right now. And if you're watching on YouTube, just go to the events section on IoTSecurityFoundation.org.